It was late in the evening, and I was sitting alone on a park bench, hand on the phone in my coat pocket, hoping beyond hope it would start vibrating. She hadn't returned any of my calls so far, but maybe this time, the message I'd left was good enough to change her mind. Every fiber in my body was hoping and begging she would. A man approached from across the park. His footfall so quiet he'd gone from a blip in the distance to sitting on the next bench over, without me even noticing. It would have been courteous to bid him good evening, but I was too focused on the device between my fingers to pay him any mind. I heard a deep intake of air. Not dissimilar to one a child would take right before bursting into song or scream. The man spoke, loud enough for me to hear. "I wish she'd call me back." His voice was soft and peaceful, like a father reading a bedtime story. Though his words had derailed my train of thought, it was the sight of his intense, unbreaking gaze in my peripheral vision which urged me to respond. "Excuse me?" I turned to him and found myself a little taken aback by his appearance. He was in all black, wearing a trilby, polished shoes, clean dress pants, and a long coat stretching from his knees to his shoulders, with a preacher's collar peeking between the folds. He had a short, well-groomed beard and strong cheekbones beneath his unblinking stare. Even seated, I could tell he was quite tall, and I questioned how someone of his stature might have been so light on their feet. His lower eyelids were pronounced, almost swollen, as though he'd been awake for days or crying for hours, but the telltale redness of either affliction was missing. As he grinned sheepishly at me, his lids arched upwards, and with the glow from the streetlight above, made his eyes look like crescent moons gleaming in the night sky. He was, by any definition, handsome and alluring, but he looked as though he'd been plucked from another time period. He touched his gloved fingertips together and then dangled his now combined hands between his parted knees. "That's what you were thinking just now. I wish she'd call me back. Isn't that right?" I blushed and nodded. Had it been that obvious? "You know the old saying about wishes," he said. Who was this man? What was he doing, parading around the streets of Cambridge in that antiquated getup of his? Why had he felt the need to come bother me? I forced a chuckle, trying to make it sound more amused than annoyed, though the scale clearly tipped towards the latter. I'm not asking the universe for much here, mate. His stare intensified, to the point of making me tense. I could feel my toes going cold as they gripped the soles of my shoes. I wanted to shoo him away, but there was something about him that I found abundantly charming and debonair. I found myself uncharacteristically enraptured by him, as though his charisma was a web, and I was an insect. "May I tell you a story?" he asked. I quirked a brow at the odd request. He didn't smell drunk, nor look disturbed in any way, but still my mind screamed no. Unfortunately, my mouth was too polite to vocalize what my brain was urging me to say. "Sure." His smile intensified, and his half-moon eyes narrowed into waxing crescents. "Marvelous." He removed his trilby and held it against his chest with one hand, while the other cupped his knee. Underneath his hat was a thin carpet of receding, dirty blonde hair, just about the same length as his beard and mustache. The preacher rotated towards me and wasted no time starting his story. "I knew a man once, much like you. Oh, but not nearly as handsome, don't worry. He winked. He too was sitting on a park bench, much like this one, stewing over his latest failed relationship. She'd started out as just another notch in his belt, but he'd grown quite fond of her. He'd even started contemplating starting a family. I'd been looking at rings the weekend before she ghosted me. Out of the blue, she'd just stopped answering my calls. No fight, no goodbye message, nothing. I can relate, I mumbled. He hummed, looking at me with his signature sheepish grin. Can't we all? So what happened to your friend? He laughed. Oh, he wasn't a friend, more like... He paused and squinted, as though in deep thought, then continued. More like a client of sorts. Well, this man sat on a bench and watched her house and called her over and over again, wishing, begging, and praying she'd pick up. She never did, of course, but all those wishes he sent out into the ether were bound to fall on prying ears. And so, on a night much like tonight, as the man was on the verge of tears and staring at his phone, a handsome, very well-dressed, very suave stranger approached him and offered him a deal. I snorted. Let me guess, sell his soul for a phone call? The preacher laughed again. Oh, heavens no. While the handsome stranger did have mysterious powers, they were nothing of that sort. No. What he asked for was 1 year. 1 single year of his life in exchange for a guaranteed phone call. You see, this stranger, this attractive, kind, charismatic stranger, had the ability to act as a sort of... Again he squinted, turning his eyes into crescent moons in the process. A kind of supernatural telephone operator of sorts. He could guarantee the man's call would go through. Hell, he could let any person speak to anyone they desired, all in exchange for a single year of their life. I snorted again and twirled my finger around my temple a few times. He sounds like a loony to me. The preacher shuffled closer and leaned in, his deep brown eyes looking into mine with overwhelming intensity. Maybe he was. But if so, then there'd be no harm in agreeing to the bargain, would there? And if his claims were legitimate, well... He paused to smirk. Then what's 1 year? What would anyone have to lose? 1 less year in the twilight of his life, half there, half not, pissing and shitting himself in a nursing home? 1 tiny, itty-bitty year, in exchange for the potential of reuniting with his beloved and living a lifetime of happiness by her side? This, the man decided, was a bargain. He accepted the stranger's deal. 1 year of his life for a phone call. I loosened my tie and looked up at her apartment building. The lights were off and the curtains drawn. Was she already asleep, or had she gone out drinking with friends again? So the guy actually said yes? I asked. The preacher nodded enthusiastically. Why, of course. I was skeptical. In my experience, if a woman doesn't want to answer, she's not going to answer. Nothing's going to change that. You can only sit back and hope she'll return the call. And it worked? I asked. His call went through? He smiled with such excitement he looked 20 years younger. It most certainly did. The handsome stranger was no liar. My leg twitched and I jumped. Had my phone just vibrated? No, it wasn't vibrating, it was just a muscle spasm. I sighed. So why are you telling me this? My boy, it's simple. I simply wish to make you the same offer I made him. I snorted again. A year of my life for a phone call? I can see you're skeptical, but think of the man in my story. He stretched his arm out and held his hand within reach. What harm could it possibly do to agree? If I'm a sham, nothing will happen. If I'm not, your wish will be granted and she'll return your call." I looked at him in disbelief. I wasn't buying it. Not one bit. At the same time, it would have been rude not to humor him a little. I shook his hand firmly, looking him in the eyes. "All right, deal." "Excellent," he said as he shook my hand firmly. In a graceful movement, he dropped his hat back on his head and pushed himself to his feet, ready to leave. I stopped him. I'm not even sure what possessed me to ask, but something did. "Wait, aren't you going to tell what happened? Once he made the call, was the man able to get her back? Did they live happily ever after?" A hint of malice flickered in the preacher's smile at my questions. He cupped a hand to his chin pensively. No, not quite. After the handsome stranger left him be, the man took his phone and dialed her number, cautiously optimistic it might actually work. She picked up, but at first all he heard was silence. It can take a few seconds to establish the connection, you see. He began picking lint off his long black coat. That gesture, for some reason, left me with a sinking feeling at the pit of my stomach. Something about it seemed so sinister. His head eclipsed the streetlight and endowed him with a broad halo. With his long, slender frame towering above me, he looked like an all-powerful god, and the lint looked like his subjects, which he callously tore from their homes and discarded with little regard. I shivered. He continued on. "The man heard static. Then slowly the static faded and made way for a soundscape unlike anything he could ever imagine. He heard the screams of thousands that seemed to echo off the walls of a deep cavern. He heard the sizzling of fire and the searing of flesh. When he strained his ears, he could just barely hear the sound of sparks flying as metal collided against metal. Frazzled and shocked, he made to hang up, but then he heard the girl's familiar voice, weak and thready. 'Make it stop,' she sobbed. 'Please make it stop.' He dropped the phone and it shattered into pieces, but the sound still came through the broken speaker. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rising. It was a story. A stupid story, but it had its hooks in me. I stuttered. What did he do?" The preacher shrugged and waved his hand dismissively. "He tossed the remains into the woods and ran home. He couldn't sleep that night, far too frightened by what he'd heard, but the horror only truly sank in the next day, when, in an effort to return to normalcy, he read the morning paper on the bus. He saw her name in the obituaries. She died 3 days prior." He smirked, and since that day, every time he picks up the phone, he hears her cries for help and the screams of the damned. But there's nothing he can do about it. The call already went through. The connection can't be broken. I'm not going to lie, I was shaken, but in the same way you get from watching a horror movie. You know it's not true, but you're still rattled. Still a little afraid of the shadows in the corners of your room. The preacher brought a hand up to his ear. "Oh my," he said, his tone light and playful. "I'm afraid I really must get going. I hear quite many people making wishes tonight. I mustn't keep them waiting." He whistled as he started down the road, adjusting his hat. I laughed a little, trying to shake away the nerves his story had instilled in me. I yelped as I felt my phone vibrating in my pocket. When I pulled it out, I saw her name on the screen and felt a rush of excitement and anxiety. It's a coincidence, I thought, and I believed that. But at the same time, there was the faintest doubt in the back of my mind. A different kind of hesitation took over. Was I ready to talk to her? Would I be able to convince her to take me back? What could I say that I hadn't said 1,000 times over voicemail? This could be my only shot. The preacher stopped for a moment and looked back at me, smirking wide. "Well, aren't you going to answer?" I swallowed hard, looked at the phone just long enough to hit the accept call button, and brought it to my ear. As I looked back up at the path, I felt a chill as I saw the preacher was gone. There was static before a frenzy of screams erupted from my speaker. Amidst the voices, as though far off in the distance, I could hear the vaguest hint of her screaming for help.